This podcast is made possible through listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. And the Florence County Museum, presenting Edward Gay, an American landscape painter, chronicling Gay's evolving style amid the turn of the 20th century and his unique connections to South Carolina and the National Academy of Design. Now through February 23rd, flocomuseum.org. And Meadow Garden, home of George Walton, one of the youngest signers of the Declaration of Independence. Open for tours Monday through Friday, 10 to 4. Learn more at historicmeadowgarden.org and visit augusta.com.
From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, welcoming you to our podcast about South Carolina culture and history, with a nod to all things Southern. Today, we'll be talking with former Poet Laureate of South Carolina, Marjory Wentworth, about her new collection of poems entitled One River, One Boat.
This collection of occasional poems and essays includes those written about heartbreaking and joyous times in South Carolina's history and Wentworth's own life, including the deaths of relatives, gubernatorial inaugurations, the Mother Emmanuel AME massacre, Hurricane Hugo, and more.
Marcus Amaker, the inaugural Poet Laureate of the city of Charleston, has said of Marjory's work, "If you want to know the nuance of the Palmetto State, read Marjory's poems." Marjory, it's great to have you back on the Journal today, although I'm very sad to know that you no longer live in the Palmetto State. You came here in 1989, and I think we ought to start off with that story about your first 2 weeks or 3 weeks in South Carolina.
Sure. We moved to South Carolina just a few weeks before Hurricane Hugo made landfall.
Oh, my gosh.
And, we bought a house on Sullivan's Island, and at the time, you could do that, It was actually the cheapest house we looked at, which is kind of crazy. And it was a funny old house, but it had a big yard, and we had 2 little boys already, and we'd been living in Brooklyn, and it was just great. And, within a month, we were displaced. The hurricane came through, flooded the house, damaged the roof. We lost just about everything we owned. And, of course, we went to Columbia to evacuate. But the storm seemed to follow us up there, as you know, Walter. And, it was a really traumatic way to start. And I'll never know how different it would have been otherwise, because it is what happened. But we stayed and we rebuilt, and I had another baby, and I began to ground my poems in what I witnessed around me. And I think it gave me a sense of the place that was very different than I would have had otherwise. Intense emotional connection to the landscape as we rebuilt our lives. And it made us a part of the place in a very deep way. I mean, we all suffered so much, but the community came together, and people knew we just moved there, and we, began to rebuild our lives. But it took about a year to get there.
Well, why did you decide to give up Flatbush to move to South Carolina?
Well, actually, Park Slope, actually. My husband was an independent filmmaker, and I was working as a book publicist, and most of my clients were actually in London. And he got offered a job by a small film company that was called Carolina South, and they were particularly interested in recruiting more independent features. And he got the job, and I think we had thought about coming down a previous summer to work on a film project that he had. So we were familiar with the area, thought it was really exotic and interesting. And the publishers I worked for, they didn't care where I lived. I mean, the work I did was, I worked at home, and they just said, we'll fly you up for sales conference anyway. And so it was kind of an adventure, but it was a way, it was like a full-time job in film.
Landing here 2 weeks prior to Hugo, with 2 young children, you really were out of your house for almost a year, weren't you?
Yes. And, I think what made it particularly difficult is we didn't really know that many people. And, in years that followed, when we had evacuations and that sort of thing, you were with your friends, in touch with your community, and it made it particularly difficult because we were just getting to know people and figuring out where do you get groceries and everything. So it was a really difficult. I mean, any sort of natural disaster in the aftermath are so traumatic. But I think that made it more difficult, for us. But, your life gets very small, in terms of getting what you need to get through the day with a 4-year-old and a 8 or 9 month old. Just trying to keep them happy and make a home. And we were able to get into a furnished condo and just create regular days for the kids was really the most important thing. And so little by little, we were able to connect with people and as the community rebuilt, we created our wonderful lives there.
In your latest book, entitled One River, One Boat, Occasional Poems and Other Stories, you refer to Sullivan's Island as a most unexpected muse. You want to elaborate on that?
Sure. I wrote that essay for a book that University of South Carolina Press published, and I think the request was write about your favorite place in South Carolina, I think, and I immediately knew that I wanted to do something about Sullivan's Island. I think Aida Rogers edited that book, and I was thinking it's an unexpected muse because of this contradiction of experiencing such trauma and such loss in a place that became sort of my subject, that contradiction. But I always felt that seeing everything get rebuilt and watching the natural world just sort of come back to life, it really was a perfect metaphor for how I felt as we rebuilt our lives. And it gave me those poems that I wrote, this intense, emotional sort of, the metaphors were so strong and the emotions were so intense that the poems were pretty powerful and, began to get published. And they were really some of the first poems I published. They came to the attention of Mary Edna Fraser, who became such a good friend of mine, and we began to collaborate. And, so it was almost ironic that this place where we've lost so much became my source of inspiration.
I really appreciated the epigraph that you used for this section of your book, and it was one of my favorite quotes from Pat Conroy, and that is, "My wound is geography." The poems that you include in this section are really very powerful reflections, your reactions to the geography of the Lowcountry, and one that just really grabbed me, and I'm going to ask you to read it in a second, and that is River, for 2 reasons. One is the reason that you wrote it. You visited the Ace Basin, and, that is a very special place in South Carolina, protected wetlands. But also, you were asked by Dorothea Benton Frank's daughter to read this poem at her funeral, and Dottie was your good friend, and she was my good friend. So this really touched a chord. And do you have your book there where you could read this for us?
Yes, I do. And reading it, this poem at Dottie's funeral was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. And I want to add that this poem, River, was in her book, Plantation, which was her second novel. And that was really when my friendship started with her. So it really has deep meaning. But I will share it now. River. The river is a woman who is never idle. Into her feathering water fall petals and bones of earth's shed skins, while all around her edges men are carving altars. The river gathers flotsam branches of time and clouds loosening the robes of their reflections. Her dress is decoupage, yellow clustering leaves, ashes, paper, tin and dung, wine dark, honey for the world, sweet blood of heaping magma, pulsing above the carbon-starred sediment, striped with settled skulls, wings, and leaf spine. The river is an open-minded graveyard. Listen to the music of sunlight spreading inside her crystal cells. Magnet, clock, cradle for the wind. The river holds a cup filling with miles of rain. But when the river sleeps, the celestial children break the sticks of gravity, grab fistfuls of fish-scented amber clotted with diamonds, ferns, and puddling clouds, adorn bracelets of woven rain, rise with islands of sweetgrass and stars strung to their backs, to wander over the scarred surface of the earth like their mothers, simply searching for the sea.
Wow. I can see why Victoria wanted you to read that. That just says Dottie.
Well, she used to always say I could say what she wanted to say with just a few words. But, I was going to tell you, Walter, the poem that I was asked to write for the beautiful book about Dottie, I wasn't able to include it in this book just because of the rights and everything. So that made me a little bit sad. But anyway, I was so glad that Dottie, just was really a big champion of my poetry, and including a full-length poem like that rather than a little epigraph in front of a novel was quite unusual, actually. And it still is unusual. And so I'll be forever grateful. And then had many other of my poems were included in her novels, and other friends had done the same, Mary Alice Monroe and Patty Callahan Henry. So just a wonderful literary community in South Carolina that will always be part of, no matter where I live.
Well, I was thinking back to your Hugo experience and the number of authors in the Charleston community that used that experience. Josephine Humphreys at Fireman's Fair, Mary Alice Monroe, Dottie. That storm really had an impact on the creative lives of those wonderful Charleston authors.
Yeah, so, it changes everything, and it really changed. It affected everyone's life in such profound ways, and the place was never quite the same. And when we were first there, it had a small town feel, and of course now it's just so crowded and so busy, and it's a very different city, very different. The Lowcountry changed so dramatically in those decades that followed.
Well, it certainly has changed, and you no longer live in South Carolina. Why did you pull up stakes and go somewhere else?
No, well, my husband and I both used to teach at the Art Institute of Charleston, and it closed, and it became very difficult to find work, particularly for my husband. He's a filmmaker turned film professor, and there's no university that has a film school in the state. So he was teaching in New York, and then he was teaching in Ohio, and somewhere in the middle of that, there was COVID. And I was teaching at the College of Charleston, but it wasn't really a job. I wasn't able to get a permanent teaching job in South Carolina. So we just got sick of being apart. That was 3 years he was teaching in different states. And like I said, COVID was in the mix. So that was, really stressful. And he had been teaching at Wright State in Ohio for a year. And then I came out to visit, and they said, "How would you like to teach here?" So we just made the decision. We're not quite ready to retire, and just not what we expected, but it's kind of an adventure. And I'm back in Charleston a lot. I'm always going to be part of the place. And I think it was it was a little bit more difficult for me because he'd already been teaching in other states. So for me, last year in particular, we've been gone about a year and a half now, was really difficult for me, kind of heartbreaking in a way. But now that I've been able to come back quite a bit, particularly for this book, I've come back. It's like I never left. Your good friends are still your good friends. You know, I was just there last weekend for the literary festival, and they brought me in a day early, and I did a big fundraiser with other poets and musicians, a big fundraiser for the artists who lost everything in Western North Carolina. And it was a really wonderful event at the Gaillard, but I also realized, like, I'm part of this place, and it doesn't matter where I am, you know. It's never going to be, you can't sort of take it out of me or take me out of it. Feeling much more at peace about the decision, you know.
And just for a little context, we should mention, for those who are listening to this later than November of 2024, that you're talking about the artists in Western North Carolina that lost everything. That was another hurricane. That was Helene.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yes, and Yes, I actually opened up the event, opened up the evening, and I read one of my poems about the hurricane. And a few people have said that really grounded the evening in the details of what people were experiencing. And then I read a more hopeful poem, but it was just a great event. I think they raised $60,000 in one night, and
wow,
we were just all, you know, grateful for the opportunity to do something to help our North Carolina brothers and sisters, you know.
In 2003, you were appointed Poet Laureate of South Carolina. And what does a Poet Laureate do?
Well, a Poet Laureate essentially represents the arts community and, you know, finds ways to bring poetry into the public life and also serve the, you know, the writing community as well. So there's really no specific mandate, and I think each Poet Laureate, whether they're a city laureate, a state laureate, or the national Poet Laureate, sort of brings their experience and their expertise to the position and applies it and finds, you know, ways to do that. It's not a paid position. It's not a job. You are expected to write and recite a poem at a governor's inauguration, and then many other occasions that occur in your, you know, in your community and in the state. But it looks a little different in every state. It's a real honor. You know, it was a great privilege to serve as South Carolina Poet Laureate.
Well, you use the term occasional poetry. So the occasion of Governor Sanford's inauguration, you wrote and read a poem at his inauguration. You did the same thing for his successor. And you were Poet Laureate of South Carolina for 17 years.
Yes. Well, you know, it became apparent to me pretty quickly that, you know, we needed a sort of system in place so that we could rotate it, because I began to connect with other state poet laureates, and most states had a sort of set system, you know, and maybe every 4 years you would get a new poet laureate, and we both know that, you know, there's just so many excellent poets in the Palmetto State, but it was very difficult to create that system, not for lack of trying, and of course, since I resigned, there has not been a poet laureate appointed, which I think there's only 2 states right now that do not have poet laureates, and we're one of them. Oh. And it's quite unfortunate.
Among the occasions that you wrote a poem, you were asked by the Post and Courier newspaper in Charleston to write a poem for their special edition the Sunday following the horror at Mother Emmanuel Church. And I would like you to read that poem for us as well, if you would.
I just want to say that I wanted it to feel like a prayer, and had a quote from Reverend Clemente Pinckney that's the epigraph, and of course he was murdered in his church. And it's only love can conquer hate, still sort of the motto that I try to live by. And it really, when I wrote that down, I felt as though the poem just came to me. Holy city, let us gather and be silent together like stones glittering in sunlight so bright it hurts our eyes emptied of tears and searching the sky for answers. Let us be strangers together as we gather in circles wherever we meet to stand hand in hand and sing hymns to the heavens and pray for the fallen and speak their names. Clemente, Cynthia, Tawanza, Ethel, Sharonda, Daniel, Myra, Susie, and DePayne. They are not alone as bells in the spires call across the wounded Charleston skies. We close our eyes and listen to the same stillness ringing in our hearts, holding on to one another like brothers, like sisters, because we know wherever there is love, there is God.
Well, that's very moving. And another death led to your writing a poem, and that's Charleston Rooftops. And it was about a young captain who was killed in Afghanistan. And how did that connection come about?
I like to write often from a newspaper story or something, and I literally still get newspapers and clip things of interest. And I met a couple of other young men who'd come back from that war. And this man who was killed was from my hometown. I lived in Mount Pleasant. I didn't know him, but I think it was one of those poems that sort of came together at the same time. I used to have a writing studio down on Broad Street in the Confederate Widows' Home, and I was looking up, at the skyline and just thinking about, the history of war and connections to place, and the flags, I think, were half-mast even. And so it all sort of came together in that poem. And that's a sestina, which is kind of has a repetitive 6 lines per stanza, and then you repeat the last word in each line. It has a very set structure, but just sort of all came together. And we always think of the Civil War, of course, starting in Charleston, but, so much happened before that in terms of the Revolutionary War. And then even during the Gulf War, I remember seeing, the military leave Charleston Harbor. So it's part of what that place is in terms of its ties to our military history,
Well, not the whole poem, but I think the last 2 stanzas really sum up what you were talking about, the connection of war with the history of the port city of Charleston.
Okay, so I'll share those with you. The names of the enemy change, but war is the inscrutable language spoken beneath the sun. The flag at half-mast stiffens in the wind. Funeral bells sound from the steeples. In the cemetery, beneath the oak trees, taps linger on the broken air. The sounds of war will rumble in the wind as steeple bells call through the sun-filled air. Birds nest in trees, twisting toward heaven.
You may have moved away from South Carolina, but all of your poems have a South Carolina connection, whether it's, you've got one on rice that Jonathan Green inspired with his work with the heritage of rice culture in South Carolina. We've already talked about the Ace Basin, our former Chief Justice Jean Toll becoming the first woman to be Chief Justice of South Carolina. Clearly, as we would say in South Carolina, you've got sand in your shoes still, even though you're now living in Ohio.
I probably literally do have sand in some of my shoes, Walter. Yes, I mean, and that's just part of who I am, and I don't know what I'll be writing about next in terms of South Carolina, but I'm sure there's a lot more poems to come.
If you were picking out one poem from your book now to read that you haven't read, which one would it be?
Gosh, I really don't know. Let me think. Well, I actually have the last poem in the book. I read this actually at the big fundraiser for the artists in North Carolina last weekend. It's a children's poem that I wrote for a children's book. I collaborate with some friends on these books, and I like this poem. It's called "Sing a Song, Rumi," and I like it because it's really affirming. And Rumi was a Sufi mystic poet, translated by former University of Georgia Press poet Coleman Barr. And Rumi is the number one best-selling book of poems. Number one best-selling poet in the world is Rumi. Beyonce and Jay-Z named one of their children after Rumi. And even though it's written for children, I think it's just very affirming and it reminds us of why the arts bring us so much joy. And I think there's a lot of people now kind of walking around post-election like, what do we do now, And I think this poem reminds us of the joy of the arts. So I think I'd like to read that. It's called "Sing a Song, Rumi." Walk out of your room beneath the morning sky. Let the sun enter your heart and find a way to keep it there. Make a song from the light falling through the air and dance even when you are alone. Dance if you are still sad. Dance when you are tired. Dance until your feet lift off the ground like wings. And later, when the stars are spinning in the night, put your ear to the ground and listen to the songs rising up from the earth. Everywhere you go, there is music.
Very nice. Very
nice. Yes, thank you.
That is a pick-me-up, yeah.
Yes, well, I think, and that's why it's the last poem in the book. And, it didn't really dawn on me till quite recently that writing occasional poems, which this book is comprised of, has really helped me write poems for young people because, when you do an occasional poem, it can't be something that people get a chance to reread over and over again and figure out the metaphors and maybe the structure and things like that. It has to work off the page. And it really has helped me write these poems for children in a way that I don't think I would have been able to do otherwise. So it's been a great gift in a way that I didn't plan on, but I'm grateful for it.
Well, there was one of your occasional poems that you wrote for your son, Taylor, on his 21st birthday. And the title, Water Boy, you just see the title Water Boy and you think, that conjures up a lot of different images. Of course, this is with the sea, but when somebody says water boy, I think about a kid who has the bucket on the bench at a football game and carrying the water out.
The literal one.
Different kind of water boy.
Did you want me to share that one?
Yeah,
please, yeah.
Yeah,
sure. He's one of those kids. He was my only South Carolina-born child, born in the summer of 1990. He's what we call a Hugo, Hurricane Hugo baby, born in the afternoon. And I've never in my life, and I grew up in a coastal town in Massachusetts, but I've never known anyone who loves the sea more than this kid. Swimming, surfing, doesn't matter what the season is. So this is for Taylor, Water Boy. Water Boy, sprung from the sea, return whenever you feel a longing for something luminous you cannot name. When turtles swim through your sleep, follow them into the deep, though it is dark and difficult diving into those places of multiplying silence. Because your home was built on a narrow mound of sand held down by wandering vines, where turtles dig deep holes into the dunes for nests, the eggs they will abandon with blind hope and the kind of faith we all hunger for. Return with flipper and wing, scales that sparkle near the sunlit surface of the sea to float beneath a blur of clouds, letting black sand spill slowly from your opening hands. You know, what's interesting, when I collaborated on this Barrier Island project with my friends Mary Edmund Fraser and Orrin Pilkey, the geologist, I learned a lot about geology and biology and just all of the unique features of Barrier Island. And I didn't even think about it until I just read this to you, that things like the vines, literally hold the sand in place, and the black sand, of course, is the sand changes color over time and fades, and so there are all these ways that these little pieces of information about Barrier Island that are included in that poem that I didn't even think about until now, which is one of the wonderful things about writing.
Well, Marjory, Alfred's giving me the wind-up sign. Are there any last words you'd like to say for our listeners before we sign off today?
No, I'm grateful to be here, and I will be back in South Carolina a lot this spring. I'm going to be at the Wild Dunes Book and Author events in January, and I'll be at the Pat Conroy Center. I'm going to be at Columbia, possibly in March, and then in June. So I really look forward to seeing you in person, Walter, and I'm not that far away. That's what I want to say. And love to everyone, and one river, one boat.
Well, Marjory, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation today. I know that I did. Marjory Wentworth no longer lives in South Carolina, but it was obvious in our conversation, as it is in her poetry, that she has deep roots here, and her love of the Lowcountry, as well as her deep understanding of humanity, shines through in her collection, One River, One Boat.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
New episodes of Walter Edgar's Journal are published on the first and third Fridays of the month and are available at southcarolinapublicradio.org or from your favorite podcast provider. We'll talk again soon.